Hey, this is Patrick from STH. Today, we're going to take a look at the Inspur Web Management GUI just to see what it looks like. Inspur is actually the #3 server in the world right now, and STH is doing a number of reviews of their products. So we wanted to give our readers a little sense on what their web management interface looks like, since a lot of our readers probably haven't used their systems. We're actually doing this web overview on the Inspur NF5468M5. That's an 8 GPU server, which is pretty popular. It's actually a configuration that we got that is a configuration that a lot of cloud customers for Inspur use. And our review is going to be published shortly after this video, but we wanted to use this video to embed in the review and show people what the actual web management interface looks like. So what you first do is you go to the management interface IP address. There you're greeted with a familiar login screen. Our particular system was set up with admin as the default password. So we're going to use that to log in. And when we click login, what you're going to see is a very interesting warning message. That warning message says, please change the default password in time. I think that actually means you should change the default password now, but that's what the message says. So when we go into the actual management interface, it takes a second or two to load, but there's a ton of information on this dashboard. You can see that there's a dashboard in terms of the running state of major systems. There's also firmware information, BMC information, overall server information, system logs, you name it. There's a lot here. In the top corner, what you can see is a menu to change the language. So we can change it to English. We already have it actually set as English, so that's not going to do anything for us in this case. So now let's go take a look over under information and then to the BIOS setup options. Inspur has the ability to change BIOS settings directly from the web management interface. That's a pretty unique feature. There are companies like HPE and Dell EMC that have this on their mainstream servers. But on the other hand, there are a lot of companies that don't have this. So examples of that might be Supermicro, where you could change BIOS settings using some of their IPMI commands or Redfish commands, but not necessarily via their web management interface. So this is definitely a feature that we don't see on all systems, and we're actually kind of surprised that Inspur has it. You can see as we click through these real quick that they're definitely set up that if you're a cloud vendor, that these are the types of things that you might set in an automated fashion between reboots. So you can tell that this is kind of a web skin of something that is driving it via an API in the background, but still it's pretty interesting. There's history in this as well, and that history actually, for this particular system, we tried it out right after doing some internal photos, and it didn't retain the information when we powered off the system completely. So that was just something to kind of keep in mind. Also, when we go, we can see information on storage. And one of the features that they have here is the ability to create a virtual drive, not just C drives, but to create a virtual drive, a RAID drive, on the Broadcom controller directly from the web management interface. Again, this is something that HPE, Dell, Lenovo have, but Supermicro still doesn't have, although I've heard that is in the works. You'll see under the power and fan that you can see power status. You can set up whether something's an active or standby power supply. So there's some kind of cool features in here. You can also see the fan status and make sure all the fans are okay. This is a big GPU box. There are a lot of fans. Under the BMC settings, you see a lot of pretty standard features and a lot of services that you would see on mainstream systems. One of the kind of interesting things here, though, is that the BIOS boot options are under the BMC settings, which is a little weird because the BIOS you would kind of consider a normal BIOS under potentially information and BIOS settings. But here it's actually under the BMC settings in its own menu. But it's also kind of nice that it's there because you can do things like UEFI and BIOS, which is pretty nice. You can also set which interface you want to use for your BMC. And if you want to have auto failover on that NIC, there's logging, which is pretty standard in a lot of these solutions. And then, diagnostic side, there's also the ability to do things like capture postcode. So if a machine were to have an issue or get stuck at post, you could figure out what was the problem afterwards. And then one of the really interesting features that the Inspur server management system has is the ability to update your firmware via the web management interface. Now, most IPMI and web management interfaces have this ability, but what Inspur has that's differentiated is a dual firmware version. And what that means is that if you had a firmware and you were trying to update it remotely, but say that firmware update went bad because maybe you lost connection or whatever happened, you have the ability to actually roll back to a different firmware image because they have dual firmware images. This is something that we see on some consumer platforms, we see it on some server platforms in terms of BIOS, but we don't normally see it on BMC firmware. This is certainly a differentiating feature and one that we really like. Beyond the firmware updates, there are other things, so you can reset the system and BMC to factory defaults, but you can also update BIOS firmware images remotely. That's another feature that is becoming more standard, but still one that not all vendors support. Now, let's go back to Remote Console. You can see that you have a number of virtual media devices, but then you have this one which says Locate Server, and you can have the system LED blink, which is something that you usually use if you have a bunch of these servers and you need someone to physically figure out which server you're trying to manage. It's kind of weird that that's in remote control. We get it, but at the same time, maybe that's one that should be under information. Heading over to console redirection, you can see that there's both a Java IKVM viewer as well as an HTML5 viewer. We're going to take a look at the HTML5 one because after using the system, we actually found it was great. The solution was really easy to use. The stickiness in terms of the keyboard and mouse movements that we made, it had the right level of stickiness and it didn't trap your mouse when you didn't want it to or didn't trap your keyboard when you didn't want it to. There's actually a lot of functionality here that's not exactly common just yet. So for example, there's the ability to configure your remote media. So if you want to, for example, load a ISO image for OS installation or driver installation, you can do that right from the HTML5 IKVM session, which is not something that all server vendors can do right now. There's still a couple that have HTML5 IKVMs, but don't have the ability to launch media. You also have power control, which most have these days. You have the ability to send keyboard shortcuts and pretty much anything that you would need. And realistically, the Inspur HTML5 IKVM is a solution that can displace the Java KVM solution. So that's actually a pretty nice feature. There's still some web management interfaces where the HTML5 version is not fully featured, so you have to go back to the Java version often. And most of us don't really want to use Java for server administration, so we think this is a great feature that Inspur has. The last thing that we wanted to mention is that Inspur actually has an in-context help menu, which is very useful, and we found it to be one of the better solutions out there. Thanks for coming with us on this tour of the Inspur web management interface. We hope you found it useful because this is going to be embedded in a number of our upcoming reviews of their servers. Thanks for watching. You can check out more from our awesome STH team on the STH main site. We have other videos on YouTube, and you can always subscribe to our channel and see whatever is coming out next.